adults are not going to be exposed either, because those are not the kinds of things that we generally read or watch. We're more attuned to our favorite sports or TV program. Now, as this thing continues to update, we will begin, and I realize it will be hard for you to participate to a great extent, but if you know the answer, you can shout it out. We've been dealing, as I said, with ancient history and modern world geography. One of the nations that was dominant in the days of the divided kingdom of Israel, that would be from about 930 BC to 722 BC, when the northern kingdom was destroyed, was Assyria. Assyria is, for those of you who understand the geography, modern Iraq. Thank you, Bill. Bill's been taking notes, and he's going to ace this quiz. I doubt that there is a country in relationship to America, at least, that has been in the news any more than ancient Persia. Ancient Persia is modern Iran. And the Iranians were the power that defeated what nation? The story is in the book of Daniel. Daniel and his friends had been uprooted and taken to this nation in the captivity of 70 years. We studied about the Tower of Babel in our Wednesday night class, and this nation traces its name, Babylon. Thank you. I don't know who said that, but I appreciate your response. We've spoken a lot about that area between the Tigris and Euphrates River. Abraham came from that area, the southern tip of it. And much of Israel's problems came from peoples who lived in that area, including the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Persians. What is the name for the region of land between the Tigris and the Euphrates River? It literally means land between the river. That's right. Thank you, David. And I heard that. I appreciate it. What three religions are tied to Abram or Abraham? Two look to him as their father. A third acknowledges that he was necessary for God to provide the mechanism through which his son would enter the world to be our Redeemer. That man was Abram. I said that. I thought everybody just said, yeah, Abram. And the three religions are Judaism, obviously, Christianity, and then Islam. Of those three, which is the oldest? Judaism, of course. And which comes next? Christianity. And Islam doesn't come along until 6 centuries later. Islam was founded in what modern country? We're still updating, I'm sorry. The modern country of Saudi Arabia. The major holy sites of Islam in Saudi Arabia are Mecca and Medina. Saudi Arabia, or Arabia, is mentioned how many times in the Bible? 7. Thank you, Bill. And of course, the last mention is in relationship to Paul, Saul of Tarsus, who became the Apostle Paul. He spent a period of time in Arabia, where he seems to have been instructed further in the gospel and mentions Arabia in his epistle, I believe, to the churches of Galatia. We don't know if the Lord miraculously appeared to Saul in Arabia and filled him in. We just don't know. But he spent that period of time there before he really embarks upon his great missionary endeavors. The Suez Canal joins what two major bodies of water? Bowen, did you ever go through the Suez Canal? Go like this if you did, and like this if you didn't. He did, yeah. He doesn't like me to single him out, so that's why I didn't ask him to speak. I'm trying to get him to turn red, though. I'm working. I'll never get Harry to turn red, though. What's that? Too cold for that. All right. The Mediterranean, the Suez Canal joins with the Red Sea. Thank you. And if you thought Persian Gulf, you're just a little too far east. The Persian Gulf is actually fed by what two major rivers? The Tigris and Euphrates, and it pours into the Persian Gulf. And the Red Sea, of course, is the border of Egypt and Arabia. Ancient Greece had two divisions composing modern Greece today. The northern section of ancient Greece was called Alexander the Great hailed from this region. Yeah, Macedonia or Macedon. Thank you, Mary. And the southern section was called Achaia. Two major cities in the northern section of Macedonia would be, the most joyous letter in the New Testament was written to one of them, to the church in that city. Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. For to me to live is Christ, to die is gain. Let your life or conversation be that which becometh the gospel of Christ. None of those verses ring out. Philippians. Philippi was one. Another would be written to a city whose name comes from Alexander the Great's sister. Paul told them to pray without ceasing. He told them, I don't want you to be ignorant concerning them which are asleep, that you sorrow not as others which have no hope. He wrote to them twice. Couldn't hear that. Still couldn't hear that. Thessalonica, is that what you're saying? For some reason, I can't hear that, but Thessalonica and Philippi, along with Laodicea, are three northern cities. Berea would be a fourth. Now, if you go to Achaia in the south, there are two cities that stand out. They are Corinth and what's the one city in Greece everybody knows? Athens. Those cities are in the southern section, which was identified as Achaia in the first century. And of course, Paul's ministry in Athens is recorded in Acts chapter 17. And his ministry to Corinth then is in chapter 18. And his more extensive of the two occurred in Corinth, not Athens. In Corinth, he spent a year and a half. He worked with what couple while he was in Corinth, providing for his needs. Aquila and Priscilla, and the three of them plied what trade? They were tent makers. Tents were a staple of biblical history. What great biblical figure never had a house, lived in a tent in his entire life, and lived to be 175 years old? Abraham. Thank you from the Amen corner. All right. Where was Abraham's home when we are first introduced to him? Ur of the Chaldees, that's right. And that's on the tip of the Persian Gulf, not to be confused with the Red Sea, which connects the Mediterranean with the Suez. What is another name for the Chaldees? Ur of the Chaldees. Chaldeans were also called What city did we read about, or what effort did we read about where they were building a tower just recently in our study of Genesis? You're talking about the Chaldeans, you're talking about the Babylonians. The most famous Babylonian king for us would be Nebuchadnezzar. I read somebody's lips. Nebuchadnezzar. You read what book of the Old Testament to get the most information in the Bible about Nebuchadnezzar? Daniel, the book of Daniel. And it's Chaldees, not Chaldees, the Chaldeans. For a long time, I didn't know there was a distinction. The modern equivalent of ancient Asia or Asia Minor would be modern Turkey. Modern Turkey. Modern Turkey is a member of NATO, for those of you who may not realize it, but it's also a nation that is estimated to be anywhere from 97 to 99% Muslim. But Turkey had a secular government up until relatively recently. With the Arab Spring, things began to change in Turkey, and they do have a president at this time, but he is taking that nation to the extent possible to a more conservative Islamic approach, is even personally advocating Sharia law, and that doesn't bode well for the NATO alliance, and problems that could arise if that trend continues. The two major divisions of Islam are the Sunni and the Shia. And the larger of the two would be the Sunnis. What nation is the primary home to most Shia? Iran. Iran. I'm thinking Israel and Iran. Iran. I don't know where Iran is other than in my imagination. And it's about as messed up today as this computer is. Just spinning and spinning and spinning. Those of you who have Windows 10, you know how that little thing just goes. It says it's getting ready, though. Don't turn it off. So I'm going to leave it alone and proceed. The CIA instigated a coup in 1952 in a nation with a duly elected government at the behest of the British, who were concerned about their investments in oil in this land. What land was that? Iran, 1952. And I wanted to bring that out because I wanted you to have some idea of the background for the hatred that exists among some Iranians toward the West, and in particular the great Satan, America. they still haven't gotten over the fact that the CIA intervened at the behest of the government of the United States, who was doing the bidding of the British to bring about an overthrow of a duly elected government, because the one who had been elected had leanings in the direction of Marxism or communism. Now, what that would have meant for the nation is unknown at this point, because the CIA interfered and the Shah came to power. And he was a vital ally of the U.S. until what year, when the Shah was deposed and the Ayatollahs came to power? Anybody remember? It's 1979. I'm impressed that you remember that. That was you, Greg, wasn't it? Were you even born then? No, I didn't think so. He looks very distinguished with his new beard, doesn't he? Have you noticed? No Shave November has brought us December fuzzy face. But it's not gray, so, it looks good. The year Israel became a nation again. 1947. You're on a roll, buddy. And of course, one of the maps that I showed you was 1946, 47, and two others up to, I think, around 2000 or a little later. And what was apparent is that from 47 to the present, Israel has occupied more and more of Palestine, and the Arabs less and less, until there's very little land actually operated and governed by the Palestinians today. And if you want to understand why this is the case, all you have to do, in my judgment, is look at that map and ask yourself how you would feel were you a Palestinian. Now, I saw just an excerpt of Mike Huckabee's response to events that occurred in the UN this past week, and the U.S. abstained in a vote that was designed to stop all additional settlements in the West Bank of Israel. And he was he was extremely angry. I can't remember his exact words, but that's what he meant. But he's extremely angry because he believes that God gave that land to the Jews 4,000 years ago, when he made the promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 and again in Genesis 15 about that land being their eternal possession. The reality is that the land promise was a conditional promise. They must be faithful, and they weren't, so the promise was null and void. But interestingly, Barnes, in his commentary on that very section of Genesis, makes the argument that that was not the intent. The actual Hebrew meaning is that they'd have it for a long time. In fact, the land is not eternal, because God will eventually destroy this entire earth, and everything in it will be burned up. But there are many people like Mike Huckabee, and I happen to think that, he's a pretty nice guy from what I've been able to see, and in moral areas, I probably would agree with him almost 100%. But when it comes to that issue and some others, he's just not being fair with the Scriptures. He's advocating a belief that most of our friends have in the denominational world if they are conservative. They're expecting this millennial reign of Christ on the earth that will bring him back to sit on David's throne in Jerusalem, where he will rule the world for 1,000 years. In order for that to happen, Israel has to maintain control of that region. And so there's a large segment of society here in America that is religious in the broadest sense of Christianity, who believe that Israel should receive unquestioned and unlimited support from the U.S. because their existence is vital to God fulfilling his ultimate plan and establishing his kingdom. To which we would immediately argue that Jesus established his kingdom, that his coming was not a failure. It accomplished the purpose for which he was sent, and that his kingdom is alive and well today. And furthermore, the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 was not meant to be taken literally. It is merely figurative for a long period of time. All right. Ammon, Edom, Moab, ancient territories constituting modern, just went over this last week. What modern nation now encompasses these three ancient nations in territory? And of course, you may recall Moab and Ammon are descendants of Lot through his daughters, and Edom was a descendant of Abraham through one of Jacob's two sons, or one of Isaac's two sons, and it's clearly not Jacob because that's Israel, so it must be Esau. The Edomites are descendants of Esau. And this whole area of ancient Moab, Ammon, and Edom is now modern. There's a river you know really well that is its eastern or western border, along with the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. Jordan, thank you. That was a land. The capital of Assyria in ancient history was the capital of America in 2016, isn't it? 2016 is Washington, D.C. Capitals are pretty important. The capital of the Babylonian Empire was the city of Babylon. And the capital of the Assyrian Empire was the city of Nineveh. What prophet was sent to Nineveh to preach? Jonah. And Jonah boarded a ship and headed in the opposite direction to Tarsus, which is located in what modern country today? Spain. Thank you. What apostle wrote that he fully intended to visit Spain? Paul. Did he? You can say probably, because we don't know for sure, but probably. Goes back to he is under house arrest in Rome at the close of Acts, but was in all probability released because Philippians seems to have been written from that first imprisonment, and it's clear in chapter 1 that he anticipated being released. His desire, he said, was to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better, but for your sakes it's needful that I remain, and I will. And after that release, made his journey as far west as Spain, and then returned and was arrested the second time, and his martyrdom followed, 2 Timothy chapter 4. All right, the year, the birthplace of Islam. In what country? Saudi Arabia, yes. Saudi Arabia. And in addition to that, who was the founder of Islam? Muhammad. There are how many pillars of faith in the religion of Islam? 5 fundamental pillars. I would ask you to name them, but that's too tedious. The region from Egypt through Israel and down to the Persian Gulf is called geographically start in Egypt, you go up. The Fertile Crescent. And that was an expression coined early in the 20th century to describe that area. It is essentially the heart and center of human civilization. Very productive, obviously beginning in Egypt, in particular in the Nile Delta, and going somewhat northeast and then north through Palestine, which was the trade route. The King's Highway ran through that area. It would go north through Syria and then began to curve sort of southeast down between the Tigris and Euphrates toward the Persian Gulf, the Fertile Crescent. Can you summarize 2,000 years of history by citing the dominant world powers during the development and ultimate captivity of Israel leading up to the birth of Christ? What seven nations essentially are the ancient equivalent of a modern superpower if you just look at the history or the progression of history in the Bible as it relates to Israel. Obviously, the first would be where Israel developed as a nation over 400 years of captivity. That would be Egypt. And with the advent of the kingdom, relatively quickly after freeing themselves from Egyptian bondage, going to Canaan, conquering the promised land, setting up a kingdom at the request of the people. God allowed this. They had, for 40 years, King Saul, followed for 40 years by King David, who defeated all of Israel's enemies. Finally, a blow to the Philistines that they were no longer a problem in his reign. And when he died at 70, his son Solomon came to the throne. And for a brief period of time, Israel was the dominant power in that part of the world. They surpassed Egypt and Assyria to the north, and others were not yet really beginning to exert themselves. So there was a very brief time when Israel was the dominant power, and there are some that still long to go back to the glory days of Solomon, when even the Queen of Sheba traveled extensively just to ascertain whether the rumors were true or not. And her conclusion after meeting and spending time with Solomon was half had not been told. He was that great. But it didn't last. At his death, his son succeeded him to the throne. And the people who had been heavily taxed under Solomon requested that their burdens might be lightened a little bit. And I know you're familiar with the story. And Rehoboam consulted his father's advisors, Kellyanne and the bunch, and they said, you ought to do that. Lighten the burden. But then he turned to his young friends and they said, nah, just, make it much, much harder. And as a result, the kingdom divided. And Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, ruled the kingdom to the north, and Rehoboam remained king over Judah to the south, 2 tribes. But of course, the kingdom divided, the power is lessened, and it isn't long until the Assyrians become the dominant force. They invade, conquer the northern kingdom, whose capital was, what was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel? Samaria. And they destroyed Samaria in 722 BC, and for all practical purposes, Israel ceased to be. They then marched to the doors of Jerusalem, the gates of Jerusalem, and would have taken that city as well, but King Hezekiah sought deliverance from God, and that deliverance was granted, and the Assyrian king got word of another problem in the kingdom, and so they left Jerusalem and Judea and went home, and he was ultimately killed by his own sons back home, but Judah was delivered. And Judah alone remained a force in Palestine. not a major force, but a force, until 586, when the folks who had destroyed the Assyrians came knocking at Jerusalem's gates again. And those folks were the Babylonians. And of course, why had the Babylonians come to Jerusalem? Something happened with King Hezekiah. He got ill, was told by God through the prophet to set his house in order. You're going to die. And his response was, he prayed. And God's response to his prayer was the addition of how many years? 15 additional years. At the time Hezekiah was told that he was going to die, he was without offspring. He had no sons to inherit the throne. But in the 15-year interim, Manasseh was conceived, brought into this world. He succeeded his father to the throne. Manasseh was the oldest, not the oldest, but he had the longest reign of any of Judah's kings, 55 years. And he was also, if not the worst, among the very worst kings that Judah had. He is infamous for having slain his own children in human sacrifice in the valley of Hinnom, which became, as a result of how he and others abused it, the garbage dump for Jerusalem. And we get a word for eternal punishment from that dump, and the fact that it burned and smoldered and stunk and contained the vilest and filthiest and worst refuse that a city could produce. It became the figure for hell. And the Greek word for hell is Gehenna, and it literally means valley of Hinnom, which was where Manasseh had offered his human sacrifice in the person of his own son. I've often thought about if Hezekiah had just died when God told him to set his house in order, Manasseh would never have been born, and Israel would have been spared one of its worst kings. But that didn't happen, and I don't know why that occurs to me. But every time I read the story, I think to myself, if he'd only died, they would have been better off. But in spite of how wicked and vile Manasseh was, God was still able to continue the lineage, and it's traced through all of these kings to bring Jesus into the world. So the Babylonians defeat the Assyrians, and the Babylonians then are defeated by the Persians. And you think Persia, you think of Cyrus the Great, because Isaiah and Jeremiah had both decreed that the captivity in Babylon would last only 70 years, and then Cyrus would arise and would permit the captives who desired to return home to go back home. That's precisely what happened. Of course, Ezra tells us of the return, the historical record of that. They laid the foundation for the temple, and then they stopped work only to be encouraged to continue the process and ultimately complete it through the preaching of two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. The year that they laid the foundation was 536 BC. The year that Haggai and Zechariah began to preach was 520 BC. There's a statement in Ezra relative to the laying of the foundations of the temple, in which Ezra records that the older folks who were present cried, wept, wailed, and the younger folks who were present shouted and rejoiced and jumped for joy. And the two made so much noise between the rejoicing and the weeping that it was hard to separate the two. And what was happening was that the older folks had memories of the temple that had been destroyed, and they realized when the foundations for the new temple was laid that it's not going to be anything like what we were accustomed to, what Solomon built. But the younger folks who'd never experienced the temple saw this laying of the foundations as a sign for the rebirth of worship and the rebirth of their city. And significant in all of that is a statement in the book of Zechariah, in which Zechariah, looking back to those events and the expressions of sorrow and joy, simply said, "Do not despise the day of small things." Anything of significance today started in a very small way. Greg and I were talking about these oaks out here and timbering them. You know, maybe the city will just come along, because Greg is saying, "I've got to rake those leaves, and it would be nice if they weren't so big," kind of thing. Every one of those oaks came from what? And they're really, a little tiny acorn. Don't despise the day of small things. The foundations of the second temple were nothing like the first, but they were so significant because they did signal a rebirth in Jerusalem, and something that had plagued Israel through its history up until this point seems to have ended. And that problem is idolatry. By the arrival of the New Testament, idolatry is not a problem with the Jews. It seems to finally have been overcome. Do they understand everything about the law and their relationship? No. But the problem of idolatry that plagued them throughout the period of the kings, the United Kingdom, the divided kingdom, and Judah alone, they seem to have learned a lesson there in some mighty way, because it's not a problem in the New Testament. The Persians were defeated then by the Greeks or Macedonians. It's essentially the same thing, under the leadership of Alexander the Great, whose father was Philip of Macedon. He died at the age of 33 or 34. Historians are not confident, but in that area. His kingdom was divided among 4 generals. The prominent ones, for the sake of our study, would be the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And the Ptolemies ultimately won out with control of Palestine. One of theirs, a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, came into Jerusalem in 168 BC and desecrated the temple, actually slew a hog on the altar. And of course, we've got Gentiles in the temple, we've got an unclean animal on the altar. The abomination of desolation that Daniel had predicted occurred there. And then again, our Lord cites that same passage as he looked forward to AD 70 and the destruction of the temple and the desecration of it by the Romans. And of course, the Greeks ultimately were defeated by the Romans, and it's in the days of these kings that God set up his kingdom that would break apart and consume all other kingdoms and would be eternal, as Daniel prophesied in 244. And all of this is designed to bring us to that point in time when while the Romans ruled, God's Son would come into the world to be our Redeemer. John, I'm starting to get a little concerned about this thing because I really need it the next hour. The computer I'm talking about, in case you're wondering, I just looked up at John and it's still spinning, so hopefully it'll do something good soon. That was my quiz, which I didn't think I'd even need, but obviously did. That was my signal to John, apparently.